Hello and welcome to 101 Code. My name is Moaz Nashawi and this is the What, Why and How series. In this video, we're going to talk about Redux as a state management. First, we're going to describe what is Redux, then we're going to see why we need Redux, and finally, we're going to see how we can implement Redux with React framework. So, without any further ado, let's get started. First, what is Redux? Redux is an open source JavaScript library for managing and centralizing application states. And we mean by that we can have one global store which have all the shared variables or states, and this store will be accessible through the entire components in your framework. To understand this more, let's discuss why we use and why we need Redux. We need Redux to centralize the state store and fix the top-to-bottom data flow in modern JavaScript frameworks like React and Vue. To understand this more, this is how the data flows in React framework, for example. It's from top to bottom. So basically, if you define a state or a variable in this component, it will be accessible to all components under this components, but it's not going to be accessible to any components above the components where you define your variable in. If you want to do that, it's going to be a tedious process. You need to define event and emit event and then pass the parameter to it. So to fix this issue, it's better if we have a one global store which we're going to put all the states or variable which is shared between the whole frameworks. And then after that, all these components will have the same access to this store and can benefits read and write the variables inside this store. Now we're gonna see how we can use Redux with React framework. First, we're gonna create a React app. Then we're gonna add Redux and Redux Toolkit dependencies using npm. Then we're gonna configure React to use Redux store. Then we're gonna define one feature, and I mean by feature a variable or a state, and it's gonna be a counter. This counter is a number. We will try to access it and we will try to increment it and decrement it. Then we're gonna define two reducers of actions. The actions or reducers are like methods to manipulate the feature or the state, which is counter. Those two actions will be increment and decrement. Then we're gonna create two components who will use the defines feature, which is counter. So let's start. First, let's open CMD, and I'm gonna create a new React app inside CD document, and inside document I have a folder called Redux. Inside this folder, I'm gonna run the following command: mbx create React -app, and I'm gonna name my app score dash app and hit enter. Now we have created a new React app. I'm gonna browse inside this newly created app and I'm gonna say cd score app, and if we do list, you can see that we have created a new project for React. Now, the next step or the next thing to do is to add the Redux dependencies to this created project React app. And we can do that by running the following command: npm install. We need the first library, which is Redux JS/toolkit. And we also need the React-Redux library or dependency. Hit enter. Now we have added the required dependencies to the React project, and it's basically ready to start implement the Redux store with React app. Let's open the new project with the Visual Studio Code. I'm gonna do open. I'm gonna browse to the folder, which is score app, and I'm gonna hit open. As you can see, now we have the React app here within Visual Studio. Let's start implementing this Redux by first going to index.js and configuring and adding the new Redux store. So we're gonna first import the provider from React Redux, and we also need to import the configure store from at Redux JS/toolkit library. Those two libraries will help us, or two dependencies will help us configure the store and configure our React app to use this store. So basically we're gonna build now an empty store, and we mean by store the place where we're gonna put our global variables or slices inside of it. And after we build this empty stores, we're gonna create new slices or new variables and add it to this store. So the first thing to do here is to define the store itself. So we're gonna say const store is equal to configure store. We're gonna open brackets, curly brackets, enter. And here we need to define that the reducer, the attribute is reducer, we open, it's an object, we open here, and we keep it empty for now. So basically this is our store and it's empty store. We don't have any reducers or slices. Once we start to create the slices, we're gonna put it here inside the reducer. The next step is to wrap our application with this provider and this store. And we can do that by using the provider, and the store of this provider will be equal to the store that we have created. And let's close this one in here. It's gonna be provider. And now, provider store, okay. Now we have configured an empty store to our React project. So basically now our React project has the access to all the Redux store variables when we start to define it. Let's now run the project to make sure that everything is working. And we're gonna do that by saying npm run start. And here you can see that we have a running React app. So basically we succeed in configuring our project to use the Redux store. Now let's get back to our project. And the next thing to do is defining our first global variable, or what we called it in Redux Toolkit, a slice. And we do that by, I'm gonna create a new folder called features. This folder will hold all our slices or all our global variables. Inside this features, I'm gonna also create a new folder, and it's gonna call counter. And inside of it, I'm gonna say I need a new file. It's gonna be counter slice.js. Here, we will hold all the definition of the counter variable that we're gonna use. So first thing to do, in order to define it, we're gonna import create slice from at Redux.js toolkit, and we need to say export, so we can export it as a module for outside, and we need to define a constant. This constant will be called counter slice. This will hold the definition of our new variable or new slice. We can say create slice, open brackets and curly brackets inside of it. We need to define a couple of attributes here. The first one is the name, and it's gonna be the name of the variable itself, and it will be counter in our case here. Then we need to define the initial state, and the initial state will hold the default value for the state or for the variable itself. So basically counter now has no variable, so we need to define, or no value, we need to define an initial state value for it. And it's gonna be object, we're gonna say inside of it the value, the initial value, let's put it at 0. So basically now the variable counter has the value of 0. This is what initial state. After that, we need to define the reducers, and we mean by the reducers the actions or the methods. So basically you define here a couple of methods. Those methods will have the ability to manipulate and edit the counter variable. So in our case here, we're gonna build two methods or two reducers. One called increment, and it's gonna increment the value by 1, and decrement, which will decrement the value by also 1. So let's write the first one, which is increment, And here we're gonna say it takes a parameter which is the state, and this is gonna be the actual value of the counter here, and it's a row function. Let's do curly brackets, and inside here we're gonna say the state dot value is equal plus to 1. So basically we read here the value of the counter, and then we're gonna increase it by 1. So if it's 0, next time we call increment, it's gonna be 1. I'm gonna take this reducer and copy it because the decrement will be the same with this small modification. So basically decrement here, it's gonna be minus. So now we have two methods, increment and decrement. The next thing to do is to export those reducers and to export the actions so we can use it outside of the slice here. So we're gonna say export const, and we're gonna open curly brackets, and we're gonna export the increment, and we're gonna export the decrement, which is gonna be equal to counter slice dot actions. And the next thing, we're gonna export the default, which will be counter slice dot reducer. Now we're done with defining our slice or our variable. So basically now we have one variable called counter. This variable has two reducers, increment and decrement. We can use them to manipulate this variable counter. Next thing to do is to add this new slice to our empty store. Remember, we have defined an empty store here. We don't have any reducer to it. Now, after we define our first variable or our first slice, we need to tell the store that now we have a new variable and we need you to use it. So we can do that by first importing the new slice, which I'm gonna call it counter slice from, and it's gonna be on features slash counter slice. And here inside the reducer, we're gonna say that we have a new reducer, which is counter, and it's gonna be equal to the counter slice that we imported here. Now the store know that there's a new variable which called counter. Now basically we have the access to this variable. The next thing to do is defining a new component which will use this created counter slice. And one thing to mention here, this process is repeatable. So basically, if you have more than one slice or one variable, let's say that you have another variable which is called total score, you will do also first, you will define a new slice, and after you define the new slice, you will import it here, and then you're gonna add it here to the reducer with a small name. For example, total score is equal to also bring the imported slice in here. In this way, you tell the store that we have the variables in here. Let's start now defining component which will use those variables or those slices. The first one is gonna be the board, which will have the reading access to this counter variable. And we can do that by saying new file. I'm gonna say that I have a folder called components. Inside this components, I'm gonna have a board folder, which will have a board component.js. Here, I'm gonna import two libraries. First, the React libraries. So I'm gonna import React from React, and I'm gonna import what we call use selector from React Redux. This one, the use selector, will give us access to read any variable from our Redux store. After that, let's define our component. So I'm going to say export default function. After that, board, I'm going to call it board. And it's going to be a function component. Inside of it, I'm going to say the const counter is equal to use selector, and I'm gonna pass the state so we can get it, and its auto function is gonna be state dot counter dot value, and this is gonna be a function here So we're gonna put it inside a bracket. Now with this line of code, we assign the variable from the slice here, the counter, to the variable counter here inside this component. So basically this is now the counter in the slice here. Next thing now, let's return something and make sure that we can read the counter from the counter here. And I'm gonna return, let's open in div and close it. And inside this div, let's say h1 your, or let's say score table. And inside of the, under that, let's say your score is, and here we're gonna access our counter value here. So let's add now this component to our app.js. Let's remove everything inside app.js so we have a clean slate. You can see now we have a clean slate. And in our project, we're gonna say that we need to import the, what we call it, board from components slash board. Now we can use it as following. Or let me close it like that. Now we have score table, your score is 0. So basically now we're able to read the variable, the global variable counter from our store. And we can make sure, we can prove that if we went to our project and we did the following. I'm gonna go to counter slice and I'm gonna change the initial value to 4. Now if we refresh, you will see that it's 4 again. So now we have access, and enabled the access to our Redux store, and we are able to read our first project. Let's put it back to 0. And now next thing to do, let's define another component which will have the ability to use our reducers, the increment and decrement. So inside components, let's create a new file. It's gonna be inside the folder of, let's call it increment, for example, inside folder called increment. And inside of it, we're gonna have increment.js, or basically the name increment is not like reflecting what we're gonna do because we're gonna use the increment and decrement. So I'm gonna call it reducer, whatever, you can call it whatever you want. So reducer here, let me do it .js, and basically I'm gonna copy and paste here so we don't write the whole code again. And inside this reducer, instead of using the counter here, let's remove this one, let's give it as empty. Here we need now to use the dispatcher because now we're not trying to access the value of the slice. We're trying to use the actions on the reducers of Redux. So we're gonna say in this case, we need to import React, this is the first one. The second one, we need to import, the use dispatch from React Redux, and we need to import our increment and decrement from our feature counter slice. So basically the increment and decrement here, now we have added it and we imported to this a new component. After that, inside here, we can say that we need to define a dispatch, which is gonna be const dispatch is equal to use dispatch. And now we're gonna use this dispatch to communicate with those actions. Let's add a button here, or two buttons, one for increment and one for decrement. We're gonna call the first one decrement. Let's add another one, which is increment. we call it also, sorry, button is gonna be increment. And now let's use the onClick event to trigger the dispatch. So we're gonna say onClick is equal to a function, auto function. This function will do a dispatch and will dispatch, the first one will dispatch the decrement. And let's take it, copy and paste to another button in here, which will be this one. And in here also we will say onClick, but now here we're gonna dispatch the increment. Now we're ready with this component. Let's try to import it from the board. So we have one table here. So I'm gonna say inside the board, import reducer from, not React here, from. It's gonna be inside reducer, and let's try to add it here by saying reducer. Now, if we check our project and we run the project, you can see that we have our score, we have the axis, and now we have two buttons. If we use the increment, we will initiate an increment value. So we manipulate this global variable or a global slice. And if we use decrement, it's gonna be decremented by 0. So basically, here's how you add a Redux to your React app. That's it for this video. If you like our content, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. This is Moaz Nashawi. Bye-bye.